Marshall has a very distinguished background, as you can see. But beyond his academic interests, he is a husband and dad who loves dogs, exercise, travel, and questions of governance. Without saying anything else, any further ado, I present Marshall Van Alstyne.
Pleasure, thanks. So it's fun being among technologists. Is where I got my start. I actually originally got my degree in computer science and did artificial intelligence work and first job for Martin Marietta, now Lockheed Martin. Kind of interesting trajectory before entering academia. So like you, I'm not a CIO in the room. So hopefully, however, we'll have a good conversation. I do want to introduce you some original research. We may actually be able to show you some differences in R&D models and how you might actually get ideas and other innovations from other alternate sources. What I really want to talk about are structural changes that I think that are taking place in business today. I want to make three broad claims in here. And the first of these, and we're going to talk about discussion from transition from industrial era to internet era, and what that means for firms, how we're going to run businesses generally. But what I really want to do is to focus on first, I want to make a claim that the transition to internet era firms is leading to these giant scale monopolies, exactly as the giant scale monopolies we got a century ago, but it's for the opposite reason. A very fundamentally different reason, which leads to different management practices. The second thing is anytime platforms go up against products, the products always lose. The platform business models always win. I'll try to give you a variety of reasons why that's the case. And the third is everything that we teach in a business school actually takes on a new form. So whether it's operations management, the IT function, the strategy function, the finance function, all of those things are going to take on new roles as a result of these new information technology business models that we're developing today. So we'll start with just the facts. Just start with some differences in how things have changed over time. So take a look at these columns here. Anyone notice anything unusual about the numbers in these columns? I'll try to make this interactive. You're free to poke at the numbers, ask questions, see what you think. Notice anything about the numbers in here? Exactly. Isn't that shocking? The employee count, often it's the 10th. I was at BMW for their centennial. They're a 100-year-old company. They have more than 10 times the employee count of Uber, and yet Uber is more valuable. The one I really like drawing your attention to is Walt Disney versus Facebook. All of us and our kids are familiar with iconic Walt Disney culture and movies that have been made. Funny thing is, you and I and our kids make the content for Facebook, and yet Facebook is now more than twice as valuable as Walt Disney. So it's incredible what's happened there. Airbnb and Marriott. Airbnb is now more valuable than Marriott. But the other thing I want to draw your attention to is the speed. Anyone notice the dates these companies are founded? Right? Uber, 9 years ago. Marriott, Airbnb 10 years ago. Facebook, 2004. Incredibly fast movement of these companies. Why are these companies so nimble compared to traditional companies? We'll see if we can give you reasons and levers so that you can actually be more like that. Another one. This is the plot of the most famous companies in the world. Interbrand puts out every October the list of the best global brands. The numbers actually represent the brand value of the firm. Until 3 years ago, anyone know who was the most famous company in the world and had been ever since they've been keeping records? Coca-Cola, exactly. So someone's paying attention. Excellent. Right, what's Coca-Cola? What's fascinating is now, 3 years ago, Google and Apple passed them in the same year. Interestingly enough, Google spends less on advertising globally than Coca-Cola spends alone in the United States. It's quite remarkable. The reason appears to be that it's the interactivity. You touch the product, you interact with it so commonly. Kids know what it means to Google, or they have iPhones. So the interactivity means they don't have to brand, they don't have to spend on that. It's an expense they don't have to incur. What I want to draw your attention to is that 13 of the top 30 are platform companies, almost the entire row. This is just based on fame. This is just based on presence or brand value. Unsurprisingly, the traffic on the internet is completely dominated by platform firms. This is YouTube, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, and others in there. And it doesn't matter where you look. If you look in Latin America, it's the same thing. If you look in Asia, it's Baidu, Tencent, QQ over there. If you look in Europe, it's also platform companies, but the Europeans hate the fact it's American platform companies, not European platform companies. We'll come back to that in a minute. How about market valuation? Yeah.
At some point, you got to define what platform versus product is, because some
Great
of the other companies
question.
seem to be.
Great question. So for the purposes of those slides, I simply separated them by the presence or absence of an external ecosystem. So I love that question. Let me define a platform. Open architecture with rules of governance designed to facilitate interactions. All three are essential. Open architecture allows third parties to attach. Rules of governance rewards them for doing so. And it'll actually help you create value and divide value and settle conflict so that third parties come to join you. And designed to facilitate interactions is so that you create wealth. So it's connecting them with a web page, connecting them with a post, tweet, ride, whatever. So it's designed to facilitate those interactions. But all three ingredients are essential to the definition of a platform. Yeah.
But would you not also say, for instance, Apple and Google are kind of hybrid of both? I mean, it's an ecosystem.
Exactly correct.
There's a platform and a product.
Exactly correct. I'll show you that when we get to the operations management section. I agree with that. I think that's right. I think that's right. So in these numbers, I actually think this is actually very important. So when we started collecting these data, originally 3 companies were in the top 5 and they weren't number 1. Now, all five of the top 5 are platform companies, and 7 of the top 10 are platform companies by market cap. Alibaba and Tencent have now moved in. This is globally, across the world. It's fascinating. They've been knocking off energy and banking that had been the dominant firms, and there are a lot of finance and banking companies in the room. They've been knocking off energy and banking that had been the dominant companies for a really long time. Matter of fact, if you look at a century-old data, unfortunately, these are nominal numbers rather than scaled, so they're not quite, they really should use consistent dollars. But this is 100-year-old firms, 50-year-old, and a year ago. These are just Americans. I didn't include Tencent and Alibaba, but all of these, steel, oil, food products, harvesting, or rubber, steel, oil. Even American Telegraph was copper wire at that point in time, right? All of this incredible industrial era. And now, platform companies, almost completely dominated in there. Anyone have a BlackBerry? No one willing to admit it anymore? Yeah, yeah, exactly. Even Obama had one, not anymore. This is an instance where I want to argue platforms beat products every time. That's really kind of interesting. If you look at what happened with their market capitalization, not their market cap, their market share, they went from half the market in 2009, 2 years after the iPhone came out, to 2% in 4 short years. That's hard to do, right? That's not something you want to achieve. Matter of fact, and if you roll it out to here, fascinatingly, in mobile, Microsoft and BlackBerry together have 2%. That's incredible. Notice the shape of that curve, convex down. We're going to argue is that there's feedback favoring Apple and Google that's working against BlackBerry in this. Can we harness that feedback? Can we make that happen? That's what I'm going to argue for taking place here. It's not fair to pick on BlackBerry. Apple screwed it up too. This one is market cap, not market share. Red is Apple's market cap. Blue is Microsoft's market cap from the 80s and 90s. What did Apple screw up in the 1980s and 90s? Closed. It was a closed ecosystem. It was a closed ecosystem. Another perfect example, platform beats product. Right? In this instance, Steve Jobs had an absolutely beautiful product, best interface on the market. Microsoft had the better ecosystem. There's no question. By the time of the antitrust trial, 6 times the number of developers and more than that in terms of the number of apps. Really quite remarkable. And again, it's that exponential growth that Microsoft managed to get, Apple did not. Nearly went bankrupt. And it's not just tech firms. This is that famous set of companies. It's Toyota, BMW, Nike shoes, GE, and others in here that are also becoming platform companies. So it's others moving in that direction. As Daimler's example, they're trying to compete more with Uber and others so that you can now use the ride-sharing tools, not only to use your vehicles through them, but even to compare other options. So you can compare the bikes or the train system or others in order to control the interface and build community around their app as opposed to one through Uber. How about Nike shoes? Critical ingredients, information, and community. What are they adding? sensors. You guys are probably working with IoT or other things like that, going to be capturing information. They use this to do benchmarking. Folks can see how they're doing. They can compare their own performance over time. They can compare it against peers or teammates or competing teams and try to improve their performance over time. That's done great things for Nike at Stock and its products as you build platforms. And it's not platform shoes, it's the platform business model that's out there. So here's one that's kind of fun. My favorite example, more relevant for, say, Taco Bell. In this case, how would you build a platform around salt and pepper? Not an obvious thing to do. They managed to do it. They used their research labs to build recommender systems. So here what they'll do is they can get your profile and ask whether or not you like floral or mint or garlic or licorice. From that, they can recommend a recipe that they will allow you to download and modify. If you modify it, you can re-upload it, which creates value for other folks. This creates, again, a platform of user-created value on top of the ecosystem. It's become so valuable, they're able to sell this data back to consumer products companies, because now you can tell what folks like, and you can actually recommend these things for them. So it actually also helps to identify trends. Really nifty way to add platform on top of a very traditional, very homogenized good. So, how's the column on the left related to the column on the right? Any ideas? How's the column on the left related to the column on the right? There are a couple of possibilities. So it's not just one answer. A couple of
on the left are also the users?
Ah, excellent. Yes. One tends to be production, one tends to be consumption. All right, that's absolutely one. Anything else? There are at least one or two other critical things. That's probably the most important one first. Any other observations? Well, the arrow should give you a big hint. One's a feedback loop, okay? Android developers attract Android users, right? LinkedIn employers like LinkedIn employees, or Upwork freelancers, Upwork projects in there. The other one I want you to draw attention to is every single one of these interactions is outside the organization. Google doesn't own those developers. Airbnb doesn't own the rooms or the hosts, doesn't employ the hosts. Uber doesn't own the drivers in there. All of these things are outside the firm. There's resources outside. You noticed earlier the employment ratios. This is what's going on. We'll come back to this in a moment because it's actually quite important. But notice that feedback. Riders attract drivers, hosts attract guests. That is characteristic of all of this pattern of users creating value for users. This was one of the first argument why platforms beat products every time. Products depreciate in value through use. Platforms appreciate in value through use. What that means is users create value for one another, so it becomes more valuable, which attracts users, which allows them to create more value for one another, which attracts users. That's the phenomenon where you get this kind of exponential growth in all of these different patterns. Now, this brings us back to this claim. Giants of the internet era resemble the giants of the industrial era, but for the opposite reason. Well, why did we get giants a century ago? All of these were driven by supply-side economies of scale. In electricity, it's here in Europe and in the United States. It's in automotive, also here in the United States. In Europe. Iron, oil, railroads, chemicals. Your first watt of electricity is incredibly expensive. Your second watt, incredibly cheap. Your first railroad car from New York to Chicago, incredibly expensive. You've got to buy rights of way, lay track, build cars. Second one, incredibly inexpensive. What this means is a feedback where if you manage to get volume ahead of your competitor, you drop price, which kills the competition, which gives you volume, which allows you to drop price, which kills the competition. It's not what's happening. In the internet era, notice what's happening here. Oh, and by the way, I want to mention, I don't know if you paid attention to Vanderbilt, Colossus of Railroads. He didn't make the goods that were shipped from New York to Chicago. He simply taxed the hell out of them. That's what Apple's doing today with a 30% tax on all the goods that crosses iTunes, right? It creates, and 30%, would you be willing to pay a 30% tax on most of the goods that you ship? Probably not. That's one hell of a tax. And that's where we got antitrust law. These guys are so abusive. Apple's standards on that 30% is abusive in terms of what they're taking on none of the value that they are themselves creating. Yet, despite all its troubles, Microsoft still has 85% market share in desktop. Alibaba, 80% market share in all e-commerce in China. Android, 87% market share on mobile. Facebook, 2 billion users worldwide. Amazon, 2/3 of all online book sales, digital and in print. YouTube, 77% of all online viewing. It's shocking how big these are, but what's happening? All of these are network effects. Users create value for users. It's a case where the product becomes more valuable as more folks use it. More YouTube videos attracts more YouTube viewers in here. Okay? The economists have another name for this, which is a demand side economy of scale. Not a supply side, a demand side. Users attract users, creates value, which attracts users, which creates value, which attracts users. It causes the ecosystem to take off. For reference, I've got a background on OT, so I've got to give you guys some equations, but we'll show them in graphs. What happens in the industrial era is that your supply curve shifts down, so your average cost of production will go out as you get volume. What's happening in the internet era is your demand curve is shifting out as it's becoming more valuable. That's why it's the opposite reason. But we're getting gigantic firms, and we're going to see monopolies in many more areas as they become transformed by platforms. That's what's going to be happening. All right. Interestingly enough, where are the platforms taking place? It tends to be here, and it tends to be in Asia. And I mean here, I mean literally California, so it's really quite remarkable. In Europe, the biggest by far is SAP, and outside of that, there isn't nearly as much. There's Naspers, but there really isn't much at all.
Why Europe is so small?
Great question. We speculate that, again, what's the reason why platforms get so big? Network effects. We speculate that it is much easier to build network effects in homophone markets. English-speaking markets, Mandarin-speaking markets, gigantic. Europe is fragmented. Much, much harder to create network effects in that. I'll give you another example. There's a completely dominant social network that was just Dutch-speaking. And for a while, it was 90% market share in Holland, the Netherlands. And then they multi-homed and they did both. And then after a while, folks said, oh, hell, no, we'll just do Facebook. And now it's gone. So that system is now gone, and Facebook now rules in that area. That's the kind of thing that happens.
Do you really believe that's the cause and not the abusive tax levels of all of those countries in Europe and wealth creation?
I do think that's a problem. I don't think that's the only reason. I'll grant that's a problem. But I do think these network effects are one of the reasons that I think that's the dominant reason. But I will grant that the tax, I'll give you a friend of mine was telling me about, he'd started a great company in, I think it was Denmark. And when he got a new round of funding, all of a sudden he had to pay taxes on the markup value of which is idiotic.
Pay taxes on everything.
You can't do that. That's a completely foolish. And so what he did is he picked up shop, took it to California, because he didn't want to pay the taxes on money he hadn't yet made. So that kind of taxation really hurts.
To California for all the taxes.
Yeah.
They're also legal barriers to entry.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they're economic and legal.
So it is an issue, but it's also the case that the network effects then span boundaries, and that's where you need to get the feedback. So that creates friction in the growth, but it won't explain this massive dominance. You couldn't get 2 billion users just on tax differences.
Got a lot of different languages in India, a lot of different languages in China.
They start commonly on English. They start commonly in Mandarin, right? Right? It's interestingly enough, the lingua franca is now English, but that's what it is. That is what it is.
I wonder how much of SAP's revenues are based on English speaking.
It's a great question. I would love to know the answer to that. I would love to know the answer to
I
that.
think the US is their second largest market.
Yeah, that would make sense. It would absolutely make sense. Here's the insight that follows from that. If it is the case that the source of value creation is network effects, where are you going to do that? Inside the firm or outside the firm? You can't scale network effects inside the firm because there aren't enough people. There are simply more people outside the firm. The managerial implication is that everything we teach in a business school has to change. That is, you take on every value creating activity that used to take place inside the firm must now take on an external counterpart, Not the old stuff doesn't matter. Of course it still matters. I'll give you other examples of it. But it means this new stuff absolutely matters. And if you're not paying attention, the competitors that run these ecosystems will absolutely pass you because they're managing value creation at a faster pace. I'll demonstrate that in a couple different ways. Let's start with a couple of illustrations. The fun illustration is to start with marketing because I will use Coca-Cola as a poster child using their slides, right? They used to be the best at the marketing. How did they do it? This is from Coca-Cola. It started in the 1980s with a single message. Then technology allowed them to do market segmentation. With improved technology, it got even better and you could do individual targeting. So I could say, he really likes, Porsches, right? And then sell him a Coca-Cola along with his Porsche. Then, what's happened now? It's virality and social influence. Now, we can take the Coca-Cola starting slide and overlay the new vocabulary. This isn't mine, this is what's in marketing departments. This is push and outbound, where the firm does it. This is pull and inbound, where who does it? The customer. Absolutely. That's the boundary. The customer is now doing it. The best example of that, I actually like Warby Parker, fashion company. They'll ship you a bunch of pairs of glasses and ask you to post your pictures on social media where your friends will vote if you look funny or if you look great. And what's happening? You are creating the Warby Parker message for them. It couldn't be a stronger brand message because you're associating with the brand and pushing it to your associates. It's a great network effect of the users creating the message for other users and saying, hey, look, you should be paying attention to this. Operations and logistics. What do we teach in the business schools? Well, any of you that went through a standard business school, Mirage being another one, you certainly have seen Porter's value chain. In this context, it's the inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics. Really simple to conceptually model this as a pipeline. What do? You take the ingredients, you combine them together. It could be technology, it could be Coca-Cola. In this case, you take sugar and water, caramel flavoring, and lots of branding, and you move water from this end of the market to this end of the market, and you charge a lot for that. These are your value-added steps along the way. Not how platforms work. Platforms work differently. They take that 2 columns I showed you a moment ago, they take the production and consumption and they move them off platform. They allow third parties to provide that. The Uber riders, the Uber drivers, the Airbnb host, the Airbnb guest, the YouTube videos, the YouTube viewers. Your job is to take the good rooms, the good rides, the good videos, and match those to demand, right? There's gonna be a lot of junk on there, and you screen that stuff off. So it's the curation function that scales. That's what's happening. Now, you made this beautiful point earlier. Well, is it hybrid business model? So of course some of them are. This is exactly the right idea. On the far extreme is Adele and Coca-Cola. It's a pure pipeline business. They make all of the stuff on their own. Airbnb and Uber are pure platform businesses where they don't make anything. In the middle, hybrid, exactly what you were talking about. Apple makes stuff, Samsung makes stuff, but they have 2 platforms on top. In Apple's case, they have both the operating system layer, which is a true platform. They also have the store, iTunes, which is a true platform. Both of those things are layered on top of the products. That, I believe, is where most companies will actually be going. As illustration, I believe Airbnb and Uber are both going to be going vertically integrating in key marketplaces and start to move more toward the middle in there. So I actually think it allows you to scale and move really fast. Yeah.
Well, they talk about how development doesn't have to be perfect anymore either, because they have
Yes.
such a big window of error that they can have, because they're not so dependent.
Exactly. Oh, hang on to that. Hang on to that. There's some actually very powerful insights in that. Hang on to that. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Okay. But yes, you can afford more errors here. And we'll show you why in a moment. But that's actually really important. That this will affect your whole R&D portfolio in some very interesting ways. One critical additional message you need to take away from this really comes out of these next 2 slides. How many rooms are now listed on Airbnb in Paris? This is, is more than 40,000, and that's a slide from a year ago. It's impossible for any of the major hotel chains to have collected that many rooms. The capital cost would kill you. But now think about it. What is Airbnb's carrying cost if a room goes empty? 0, nothing. What's fascinating is this property now, gospel in Silicon Valley, and everyone's heard it. Uber doesn't own taxis, Facebook doesn't make its own content, Alibaba doesn't have its own inventory, Airbnb doesn't have any real estate. We've gone from a model of just-in-time inventory to what I call not even mine inventory. I'm selling your stuff, I'm selling someone else's stuff. If you have zero marginal costs of production, of course you can scale incredibly fast. That's why these firms are so damn dangerous to incumbents, because they can produce at a rate that you can't conceive. They have no carrying costs. And if something screws up, we'll come back to it in a moment, they don't bear those costs. It's really interesting. So the traditional ops management models break down under these scenarios.
Maybe, I want to interject something, and this probably goes back to Bill's earlier question. I mean, it is obviously impressive to see the disruption of what these people have done with the business model. But what you say to, for instance, an Uber, I mean, many, many years ago, somebody decided to operate a business to transport people. And then there were issues with people getting attacked or raped and what have you. And then the government stepped in and said, no, to transport people, you have to have a license and you have to have what they call a medallion, et cetera, et cetera. And that actually, for a lot of people, was a lot of money in investment. I mean, a medallion in New York City would cost you about $100,000, right?
Actually, I think it was almost $1 million. At the peak, it was about 900,000. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in comes in this disruptor that doesn't have to deal with any of those things and tilts the playing field in their favor. I mean, where do you see, I mean, how do we reconcile this?
So how short an answer do you want? There's a lot in that question.
The notion that
Yeah.
these companies are extremely dangerous to the incumbent. What
Absolutely.
What I'm also submitting is that the incumbent doesn't have
Absolutely.
the same rules to play by.
Well, this is where so one of the later answers, not the initial answer to your question, one of the later answers is how do you transition? And we probably should talk about that later. So one of the messages is if you're running a product company now and you're not paying attention to what's happening on the platforms, you're in trouble. We also have to ask the question, when will a market transform? And it's not always the case that all of them will. But let's answer your question. So part of it is internal regulation. And if we go back to the history of the medallion, it's actually quite interesting. We had the opposite problem. That the medallions were issued in New York in the Great Depression. And the reason was that so many people were driving around creating pollution, they simply wanted to collect nickels in order to eat or survive. And there were so many people doing this. There was immense congestion, immense pollution, and they were depressing the prices for everybody. So the city decided to create a monopoly in order to reduce that congestion and actually make it somewhat more efficient. Over the next 80 years, the number of medallions did not expand as fast, and a government mandated or designated monopoly was no longer efficient. So the quality of service was not as good, the prices were too high, the wait times were too long. It is almost always the case, technology can be used to pierce arbitrage opportunities. And there was a clear arbitrage opportunity. In this case, Uber stepped in because the medallions were too restricted at $900,000, almost $1 million. That's absurd for something like that. And the quality of service has gone up, the wait times have gone down. There's plenty of economic evidence that the welfare benefits of Uber having entered various cities are enormous for the citizen and for the drivers, not for the taxi industry. So anytime there is inefficiency in an economic system, expect technology to pierce it. Platforms are incredibly efficient at increasing the utilization rates of underlying assets. That's one of the predictors. If there's spare capacity, create a market in that spare capacity and it will happen. Second part of your question, government used to step in to deal with some of these things. How do we define a platform? Open architecture with rules of governance to facilitate interactions. If the interactions fail, if you're going to get robbed in an Airbnb, robbed in a taxi, then the interactions fail. Notice both Airbnb and Uber self-corrected because their interactions were failing. Folks didn't want to bring them rides or guests or travel with them or stay. They self-corrected, they provided identity, authentication, and insurance. The rule of thumb for self-governance is to absorb that level of risk that pulls new interactions onto the platform. That creates the value. So to the extent that there's a failed interaction, it will self-correct on a platform. And if you understand the rules of governance, that's what should happen. Now, whole separate question about fake news and fake products, but that's, again, where I say that's a longer conversation. Okay, so we can pick that up, but there's a lot underneath that. All right? Any other questions on this?
Does a platform have to have a certain size or scale, or does it implode if it doesn't reach some size?
So usually they'll get passed by someone doing it better than actually imploding, with a few exceptions. The exceptions occur when you allow too much congestion to take place. If the natural network effects pull enough transactions and you don't curate them so you get crap on there, there's a wonderful story that we tell in the book on chat roulette. Do you never know of that story? It's there's an example of one that did implode. I don't know why it was so popular, but it was a simple video service where literally you would connect to some random person around the planet and interact with them for whatever one you wanted to do. It's a video service. And initially it was just kind of playful. Folks would change in language. And then it seriously developed what has been called the naked hairy man problem. Which,
Say that last part again.
yes, which caused it to collapse. So you need to curate the quality of the content in there in a way that makes that happen. Otherwise, what usually happens is someone else will pass them by doing a better job. Usually they won't collapse if their curation. Another good example is Craigslist. It's been around despite the fact that it really should have been run much better than it has been run. God, it's run with a dozen people. You could fire 8 and you'd get everything the same way. That needs to be read or better run, but it's still protected by network effects. Yes?
Even if due to some of the companies who are not in the same business as they started, or they have significantly widened. Even Apple is in many different businesses.
So platforms almost always have a natural progression of what we term platform envelopment. Literally what that means is you'll take an adjacent platform and move into an adjacent market by adding a new set of interactions to the interactions that you have. And this expands into adjacent markets. If you're interested in that, I can actually show you the process, what usually happens, and even how you can strategically select adjacent markets. The crux of it is having an overlapping user base. So look for users with a service that you can add. When we get to strategy, I'll show you why that's such an interesting and challenging problem.
Amazon is a perfect example of that.
Yes, it absolutely is. And expect another interesting example of this. In almost all the consulting we do, I don't care if I go to financial firms, if I go to automotive firms, if I go to legal firms, they're all scared of Google. And you would think it's a completely different business starting in search, but they're all scared of Google. Amazon has many of those same properties. Tencent in China has at least as many of those same properties. Very interesting set of dynamics. I can show you again why that's so dangerous and also how to predict it if you're interested. Yes?
Are there segments of the economy, or are there certain businesses that are, at least for now, relatively impervious to this?
Yes, absolutely correct. I was going to save that for later, but there are a couple of things that predict when a market is likely to transform. Those predictions are, 1, the proportion of value created by information. Finance and video and code are great among those. Technologies businesses are in among those. 2, what is the extent of spare? So you would think that the information industries might transform. That makes perfect sense, and that the heavy asset industries would not transform. In contrast, the way you do expect them to transform is when there's spare capacity. If there's spare capacity in heavy asset, you can time slice it and create a marketplace in that. Good example is Uber. Another is there's a company in Massachusetts looking at MRI machines, multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment used 40% utilization rate. You can time slice it, sell it to smaller doctors' offices that can't afford it, and of course, sales to Honeywell and Siemens go down, but the marketplace goes up in that context. The last couple that you really want to think about are, 1, the extent to which it is a discrete, easily produced product by a third party. A ride, a tweet, a stay, each of those are produced by a third party, so it can be done outside. Remember I showed you those 2 columns of production out there. So a Boeing aircraft is highly complex, and you're not going to get third parties easily producing that. So tiny modular products. The last category, fault tolerance. If experimentation is cheap and easy, You want third parties to do it for you. If it's a pacemaker or a nuclear power plant, don't open APIs on it. You'll kill people. So those are the criteria as to when you expect to see market transform or not. Okay? And the farther you are in different dimensions, the easier it is to make that transformation. Finance, another area absolutely we should expect to see transform. One of the big issues here is stop valuing just your own assets. You have to value the assets of the community outside the organization. Otherwise, you will grossly underinvest and miss the true capital value of the ecosystem. I love illustrating this with a story that's only a few years old now. It's literally launched by a finance professor who should know this stuff. So there's a finance professor at NYU who, when the venture capitalists put $1.7 billion into Uber for the first time, said, this is insane. They have a few hundred million in revenues, not profits, a few hundred million in revenues. How could you possibly be putting $1.7 billion into a corporation like this? So he runs his numbers, does the DCF, discounted cash flow, and says, can't be worth more than 5.9 billion. He was very graceful, did something very classy. He put his spreadsheet out and said, you disagree with me, run your own numbers. The guy who did run those numbers, Bill Gurley, down the street, right? He said, okay, great. One of the things you're missing is network effects. His illustration, of course, many of you will have seen this napkin sketch from the COO of PayPal. More drivers attract more riders, attract more drivers, attract more riders. You get this feedback going. But then something happens. Once you get sufficient density, you're not talking taxis anymore. I can go after Hertz and Avis. Now I'm going after the rental car market, not just yellow taxi. And then after I get more density than that, I can go after Ford, BMW, and Toyota. And then after that, I can go after logistics. And now I'm going after FedEx and UPS. We're not talking taxis. Think what's happened. The boundaries of the market have moved. This is like that platform development. But now we're not just talking taxis. We've taken the demand curve and we've moved into rental cars. And then we've moved into cars, and we've moved into logistics. It's a huge change in the organization of the marketplace. Interesting, side note, when they made their investment, they had the internal numbers of Uber. They'd learned that between 2009 and 2014, when this story took place, the San Francisco taxi market had grown by a factor of 3. Well, interestingly enough, if you take 5.9 and multiply it by 3, you get 17. He was right. He just didn't factor in the network effects or the growth in the market. So you have to look at the external community and think of what you're going to do to change the value of that marketplace. Other illustrations? Yeah, the question?
How do you put value on that? I mean, the reality is there's a bit of random luck that can play in your favor because sometimes, look how many social media-based startups hope that the network effect is, the community effect is going to take them to higher grounds. I mean, it never happens.
Yeah.
So how do you put value on that?
So we have a couple of techniques for trying to do that. In a nutshell, one of the things you really want to try to do is to look at the lifetime value of the users and the engagement of those users. To give you a simple illustration, just with the next slide, how would you value Instagram? It bought it for $1 billion when it had 13 employees. Well, you could have hired any one of those 13 employees for a lot less than a 13th of a billion. Run the hypothetical, how much would they have paid for it if there were 0 users? $0. But you can do these numbers in your head. 30 million into $1 billion, it's $33 a head. They're paid $33 per person, and now it's at least 45 or 50. So on those terms, it's a bargain. You're really looking at the lifetime value of the external community. Now, you can live by the sword, die by the sword. It could be the case that you can grow really quickly and you can unravel really quickly. So it does happen that you have to pay attention to the engagement and being able to keep them. If you can't keep the users, that's going to dissipate quickly. But if you can engage them, you can get them producing value for one another. But the strategies are you need to make sure they're producing it for you and not for someone else. So there's some strategy involved in getting this done correctly. Other just fun examples of this. He goes to the moon and takes 5 photos. They go to the bathroom and take 37. Right? Right. You want to be the one capturing that information as it's produced and capturing the value on your ecosystem. Human resources. This one's kind of obvious. Once you see it, it's plain. Right. Your emphasis shifting from employees to contractors and from experts to crowds. what do we teach in business schools? Well, IT has allowed you to go from hierarchical organization to flat organization. You're able to manage more people inside the firm. But that's not where we're stopping. We're also going to cloud labor, right? In this case, you're able to get freelancers and contractors outside the firm, identifying quality, pulling them on, owning the product of their work. In fact, would you rather have the expertise of Tripadvisor or a single travel agent? Well, of course, if you're sensible, you want the accumulated expertise of tens of thousands of people for your cruise or destination or your hotel than of a single person. Or would you rather get legal advice in-house for $3.50 an hour, or could you get it almost for free with 6 different kinds of answers at Rocket Lawyer, Legal Advocate, or LegalZoom, or other places? It's much better to do it that way and get this crowdsourced information at a much cheaper rate. And you can triangulate on answers, again, outside the firm, not inside the firm. It's quite interesting what's happening. IT, this one's special for you guys, all right? How did IT start? Well, a lot of the stuff is back office automation, enterprise resource planning, what we do with there, inventory tracking, restocking, process control, workflow management. That moved over time to what? Back office to front office, lead tracking, taking order, point of sale, price quotes, campaign management. Now we're where I would call out of office. Now you're using IT to do community building, sentiment analysis, inbound traffic, search engine optimization, media monitoring of your brand, all outside your firm. If you're not doing that, you're not paying attention. Now, bonus, just for this audience. We ran some of the very first studies. Any of you using APIs? Any hands up? Any of you not using APIs? Okay, this is the IT community. All right. So this, by the way, is a plot from the programmable web of APIs it made available, and the links are mashups or combinations of the APIs. And they span social media, job search, e-commerce, tools, payments, messaging. Amazon participates in all of these, Walmart in this one. Actually, if you want the data, if you look at others, Amazon has these, Best Buy, these, Sears, Target, Macy's, Walmart. Care to guess what their market caps have done? That's the market caps of the major retailers. I'm going to argue that Walmart and Amazon both are world-class in logistics, both of them. Problem is, you can only squeeze so much more out of your supply chain. Once you've optimized the hell out of it, you can't get a lot more, you can't squeeze much more blood from a stone. In contrast, if third parties can build on top of your platform, you can resell your books, you can attach to Amazon Web Services, you can set up stores on top of Amazon. Third parties bring you those interactions which add value, and of course, Amazon grows. It's shocking. Walmart grew over 10 years, 48%, Amazon over 2,000%. It's incredible. Now, to give you a bonus, we are the first to have actually run the statistical evidence of this. I'm not just giving you stories. We actually did the econometric analysis. So we got 200 firms. We looked at the firms that opened APIs over time. We then compared their performance, their cost structure, their revenues, their market capitalization after they opened their APIs. Anyone notice, there are 4 blocks of firms here. Anyone notice any trends, any changes in these lines? Anyone want to venture identifying patterns?
We'll have a major jump.
What, where?
When they introduced their API sets.
There you go. Okay. Block of red firms introduces their APIs, boom, net income. Black firms introduce their APIs, boom, net income. Green firms, purple firms. Now, this is over a 6-month period, so this is quarters. So this is a quarter before and a quarter, so it's not instant. Don't expect that, right? So it takes them half a year to make that happen, all right? But it's remarkable. We find statistical evidence that on average, a $2 billion firm gains 4% market cap. That's staggering. That's huge. By being able to open APIs and have third parties attached to your organization, or gain internal efficiencies to gain flexibility, all right? It's really interesting. If you're interested, We have that's an academic version of the paper, so it's full of Greek and econometric equations, but if you're interested, the paper is available. I'm happy to share it. But we're also happy to give you the managerial version in person. We haven't written the managerial version yet, but we will. But there's some data on that. Yeah.
So as you think about the people in this room as IT leaders, we used
Yeah.
to get in the room and go, what are you? Oh, I'm a .NET shop, I'm a Java shop.
Yeah.
That's all gone away. Now
Yeah.
I'm a Salesforce, Workday, Oracle, right? We're now a group of
Yeah.
platforms creating different ecosystems. Now I see people who have similar ecosystems to me because those are the people who have my problem.
No.
I don't have yet a Uber next to me, but I do have a company that likes to do things their own way and break the APIs because we're different.
Yeah.
As I try to push them back to APIs to go, that's where the power is.
Mm-hmm.
So again, just as this phenomenon kind of impacts people in the room,
Yeah.
we may not have Uber next to us today, but we definitely have these platforms in our backyard.
Yeah,
Either we're creating them or
absolutely.
we're buying them.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I don't have the variety in my sample. I only have two cloud services firms providing the APIs, and all of these, by the way, are open APIs. We don't have any firms whose APIs are behind a firewall. That's not in our data. It's also the case, very interesting to encourage experimentation on your APIs under some very specific terms. You want to get others to give you new ideas, to bring you new possibilities, and see if you can get them to drive traffic or give new uses of your data. You have to also be very careful about exposing yourself to some risks in there. Like the API case. If it's fault intolerant, you're not opening APIs on it. And if they can figure out your customer names and databases, you've got to be careful about masking those kinds of data in there. But short of it is, if you can promote clever experimentation where you pull their code in and give them back an answer, you can do some really interesting stuff.
And I look at some of the medical partners in here, right? I could barely get EDI working with the carriers. APIs is a whole different, I mean, in about 30 years we'll be talking APIs in some of these industries. Right?
Yeah. R&D and innovation. This is what I want to also get to. Again, why I say platforms beat products. This is the same story, actually. Platforms open themselves to innovation from the outside. The best person to articulate this, again, another person from here, Silicon Valley, Mark Andreessen. A platform is a system that can be adapted to needs and niches the original designers didn't anticipate. That's a really, really important insight. You enable third parties you don't know to bring you ideas you don't have. That's unbelievably powerful. You need to do it in very careful, very specific ways. I can illustrate it for fun with an industrial era product. What was one of the first consumer modular products that can be remade and recomposed? Ford Model T. Users could take it apart and remake it to create hay carriers, flour mills, race cars, mobile churches, snowmobiles, sawmills, and goat carriers. Each of these things were innovations not designed by Henry Ford. Okay? You need to allow that to happen. Other interesting ways, illustrations of that. This, by the way, is accesses, not market cap, but accesses to MySpace versus Facebook. MySpace should have won this. They absolutely were first. They were bigger. They had the bigger social networks. You're asking a question about latecomers in here. Facebook came late. Any of you know what happened with this bump right here in 2006 in Facebook? Right there, what happened to this bump? Anyone know? Time? What's that? No, it's a good guess, but no. Because remember, Apple didn't come out until 2007. So Apple didn't come out until here, and Apple didn't go to developers until even later. So mobile was not the driver for that.
When did they get purchased? Was that around?
When did MySpace get purchased?
Yeah, that's when they
That's it. That's it. Right. That's when they went from .edu to .com, and that's when they got that bump there. What about the convex growth? What did I tell you earlier? That's when they opened to developers, and Zynga brought them Farmville and Mafia Wars, and folks started spending hours on inviting their friends, making it more attractive to developers, so more folks to spend more hours social gaming and creating a feedback loop. A wonderful summary post-mortem of the decline of MySpace, including a direct quote from the founder. We tried to do everything ourselves. We should have picked 5 to 10 key features and let everyone else do everything else. What have they done? Same mistake Apple did in the 80s and 90s. They kept it too closed. They tried to control it all themselves. You need to open it in ways that allow others to bring you, people you don't know, to bring you ideas you don't have. And you have to reward them for doing it. You have to enable it. You have to reward it. Again, platforms have these rules of governance. The mistake that technologists usually make is simply to throw it open in a field of dream strategy, hoping someone will come build on it. You have to reward them. You have to promote it. You have to thank them for giving you ideas that you didn't have. So you need to do that component of it. Here, if this is this is Windows, you own Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, and let the ecosystem build all of this other stuff because it brings you all of this additional value you didn't think about. The last app, trivial. You don't really care about that individual app, but you really care about the millions of trivial apps that are each individually bringing you something of value. Because the integral from here to here is dwarfed by the integral from here all the way over to there. It's not even close. Right? So you want that long tail of innovation that third parties are bringing that keeps you ahead of the curve. Let's express that differently. Whatever your innovation trajectory is, I don't care. This is time, this is value add of your own internal team. Now, suppose it's the case you manage to get third parties to come in and change your slope because they've added more value. If that happens, they can start from behind and you're guaranteed to overtake them. Why? You're just accumulating value at a faster pace. That slope has to cross the first one. Once you see it, it's obvious. But it has to innovate faster. There's also another property that's really interesting. What's your cost of failure if Flappy Birds fails? You don't care. Doesn't hurt, no skin off your nose. But what's your upside if Angry Birds succeeds? 30%. So you got the option on the success and you shed the cost of failure. That's a hell of an innovation trick. That's a really different business model. And it gives you ecosystem experimentation in ways you can't generate on your own. Because your users will be closer to their own problems than you are. So enable them to do things with your stuff that they haven't been able to do previously. And they'll take it in new directions.
So you mentioned earlier curation, which was really an interesting concept. Is curation intended to keep the noise out of it or to keep reputational brand tarnish out of it? What does curation do?
Both. So the best way to think about it, really press on those definitions. Open architecture, rules of governance to facilitate interactions. The curation facilitates healthy interactions and discourages unhealthy interactions.
It's a vetting process. So that's
Bingo.
When Uber scans the drivers, basically,
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about.
Right. eBay wants to keep unhealthy transactions off and pull the healthy ones on. YouTube wants, porn and copyrighted stuff off the platform and it wants the healthy stuff on. Facilitate healthy interactions.
Because it turns off participants if it occurs, right?
Yeah.
It slows down that adoption and growth.
Exactly. Users like going to iTunes because they know it's safe, they know they're going to get quality. Right? It's your job to help do that curation to protect them. Right? That's what you do in fostering those interactions. That's the nature of it. Okay? Strategy. This also is a big shift. And I like to juxtapose this against what we traditionally teach as strategy in business schools. What do we usually teach it's just Porter's 5 forces. And we can use that to analyze, well, you might have thought that the handset market in 2007 was impermeable. If you take a look at where it was, 99% of all handset profits were controlled by a mere 7 firms. They had giant supply-side economies of scale. They had names like Nokia, Samsung, BlackBerry, Sony Ericsson, Motorola, LG, RIM, all really famous brands. They had regulatory protection in telecommunications because you had to sell through the telecommunications providers to get onto the network. Nokia alone had dropped $40 billion in R&D, so they should have had the latest features. That was not the issue. What's fascinating is that 6 years later, all of them but one were losing money. 92% of industry profits were then controlled by a single firm, Apple. I love the observation by the former CTO of Nokia. Is it really the case that the management of all 7 companies were clueless, or had the business model changed? we like to argue the business model had changed. It's more of a platform, less of a product. Again, I argue, in any instance where the two compete, the platform always wins. The reasons are, one, on a platform, value appreciates with use, not depreciates with use. And two, the innovation is faster if you open it in the right way. Okay? So those things, that's why the platforms typically win. Yeah.
So I think one of your previous slides, you showed the iOS compared to the Android.
Yes.
And iOS was much smaller.
That's correct. It's about 12, 13%.
So everybody else who's, again, more on the open is not doing as well.
That's correct. Careful. This is, again, it's a much longer issue. There's an optimal level of openness. At the far extreme is Linux, which is too open. Can't monetize it, can't steer it. You have to, I've got a whole lecture on how to do openness the correct way. There's a chapter in the book on openness. We'll give you 4 or 5 different business models on how to do that. You have to open, go back to the definition. You can either open the architecture or you can open the governance. Do not open both. Linux has opened both. You can change the architecture, you can change the rules, you do whatever you want. The problem is everyone else can do the same. So your choke point can easily be routed around. Interestingly enough, Android almost went too open, and the Chinese companies forked them. There's now Android open source, and there's now Android, and Google is scrambling to retake control over Android at the API layer, right? You have to be very careful. If you lose control, you can't steer it and you can't monetize it. If you keep it too closed, you don't get the innovation. So there's an optimal level, and you have to maintain the control points. Again, we can tell you how to do that, but that's another, again, that's a longer, very complex set of issues. We can go into that in the break or something if you like. So what do we teach for strategy? What do you do? Well, the goal is a protected market niche. You build entry barriers, right? You manage the 5 forces. You manage the buyer power. You manage the supplier power. You keep out new entrants. You mitigate the threat of substitute products and rivals that are in the industry. You want barriers to entry and boulevards of exit for the competition in there. You either want product differentiation so you can charge a lot, or you want cost leadership in order that you can justify low prices and beat the competition. That's strategy. And you own and control the key resources so your competitors can't make the same stuff you do. Again, not how platforms work. Here, the goal is these interactions. You want the third parties to bring you the value. You want the YouTube videos, you want the rides, you want the Airbnb stays, you want the Android apps on your system. So you want these interactions on your sets. The network effects, demand-side economies of scale, protect you every bit as much as supply-side economies of scale. So you want the demand side, you want the network effects on there. You also, think of this, you need frictionless entry of demand and supply, not barriers to entry for your competition. It's a completely inverted business model as you're going outside. Your producers can become your consumers. You can ride with Airbnb, can't ride with Airbnb, you can stay with Airbnb today and then host with them tomorrow, ride with Airbnb and then drive for them tomorrow. Salesforce is a beautiful example of that. When they first got going, they had 2 orders of magnitude fewer engineers than Oracle and SAP. So how'd they compete? They enabled their customers to create new apps and sell them through App Exchange. They beat Apple to market by 2 years as having the first App Exchange. They don't get the credit because they're B2B as opposed to B2C, but they did it. What that did is it converted your demand into your supply and went back and forth. Brilliant strategy, really clever. Also, competition is multi-layered in 3-dimensional chess. Here, yes, it could be Apple versus Android. It could be Google versus Microsoft. It could be Facebook versus Myspace. That's one. 2 is you need your key partners to, in economic terms, mono-home as opposed to multi-home. So Facebook doesn't want Zynga over on MySpace. It only wants it on its system. So you want your competitors' partners to multi-home and come over to you. You want your own partners to only mono-home and stay with you. You have to manage their partnerships. You need to manage your partners' partners. You must also manage this curation. That's exactly what you were asking about earlier. The curation and the issues here is make sure the healthy interactions are here. So if your riders rob your drivers, they're going to drive them away, right? If the Airbnb room is flea infested, you're going to drive them away. So you have to manage that interaction. And then lastly, this is critically important, you need to manage the interaction of the relationship of the partners to you. Not the platform and to each other, but to you. So if Zynga steals the relationship from Facebook, that's bad, right? You need to actually manage that relationship. So it's, again, it's three-dimensional, and that's why governance is so important. You need to have the rules of how the relationships work among the partners in order that you capture and create value and manage to mitigate conflict. Here's something that's interesting for you. What about dangerous entrants? The most dangerous entrants in your market are those with stronger network effects. So imagine this is your existing product and someone with a bigger network comes in and with stronger developer pool or bigger community. This is what you were talking about earlier, okay? Platform envelopment, all right? This guy comes in and they can envelop your features and pull them onto their platform. And if they do that, they can pull your developers and users onto their platform as well in here. And then your network shrinks because their network is stronger. The network effects pull them onto the other in the same way that the Dutch social network disappeared. That's what happens, okay? There's a critical insight in here. This is really important, especially for technologists, and this one you need to take home. It's easier to add a technology to a community than it is to add a community to a technology. The platform owns the community, and an ecosystem partner can provide the technology. Let me illustrate. So, here is Google Maps. Apple didn't make that. That killed Garmin. Here is Evernote. Apple didn't make that. That killed Filofax. Here is an HP calculator. Apple didn't make that. That killed HP. In every instance, an ecosystem partner added the technology. Apple didn't do it, and ironically, neither did Filofax or Garmin or HP. A third party did it. If you own the community and you own the relationship, you're safer. That's, again, why platforms win. It is easier to add a technology to a community than it is to add a community to the technology. And this is why you have to really watch for platform development, because a partner that comes in with a bigger network can absolutely crush you. There's no question that always happens.
Do you ever look at the overlap of that specific topic with blockchain and the way the blockchain is
I'll be honest, I
to move forward?
I haven't looked at that question specifically. I have some speculation about what will happen there. Certain areas, I think it's going to be fundamentally a big shift, and in other areas, I think it's the issues are way overblown. I don't think it's going to develop to the level that folks think it's going to develop. The areas where I think it's going to work, it's going to fundamentally change auditing. Anyone with an app can now certify your books because you don't need to send in an army of accountants. Where it's overblown is in transaction scale. The technology is designed in a way that you can't forge it by making it hard to forge, which means that you can't get the Visa scale transactions. So the scale won't happen. But if you're certifying ownership of an asset like a house or a diamond or a car, there it'll be incredibly valuable. So it's going to be those cases where certification, information asymmetry, asset ownership is essential. There it's going to be profound, very, very big. It'll be another instance of finance moving outside the firm. Rather than internal books, they become publicly inspectable books. So a lot of that internal accounting becomes external.
So do you consider blockchain a platform or technology for both?
Mixed. Three ingredients of the platform: the open architecture, it's got that. Facilitating interactions, it's got that. The governance model, it's been designed as a libertarian dream to prevent a governance model.
That's what it's trying to get rid of.
Exactly. So in that sense, it's not a true platform, it's a standard, right? It's more like HTML. If Again, this is where the speculation comes in. If it's the case that someone or some government manages to introduce a governance model, then it will become a platform. There are ways, I believe, of actually introducing multi-key crypto in such a way that I think that would be possible, not on top of Bitcoin per se, but using blockchain-like technology when it would happen. And I think when the first government to do that will actually do something really interesting and likely take that off. Again, that's the speculation portion of it. So again, I haven't studied that.
Your point about, it's easier for a community to adopt a technology
Yes.
than the other way around really resonates in that space, because if there's already a central clearing facility, let's say, and there are tens of thousands of corporations or entities on that network, moving them one by one onto some blockchain that's going to grow, I don't know how that happens.
It'd be, again, I was talking with someone at lunch. Really, it's a willingness to adopt. It's not a technology challenge. And it's moving folks onto a standard. Payment systems in general have this two-sided property. You need the merchants to accept and you need the consumers to carry. We actually did some of the first math on two-sidedness, and these payment systems have this all over the place. It's very, very hard to get folks to change in that. So Bitcoin, standard technologies have a big lead in there, but it's also got some fundamental challenges in efficiency and in absence of governance by design. But there are reasons why every major economy has the equivalent of a Federal Reserve. There are benefits to that, and being able to, for example, control variability of the currency and inflation, other things like that, very interesting trade-offs. If you compare strategy under the old product model, distinct buyers, suppliers, entrants, substitutes, you focus on the core competencies or supply side economies of scale, you control the inimitable resources, focus on cost leadership or product differentiation, you have barriers to entry or boulevards to exit for competitors, and you would do the innovation. Flip that. Platforms, you have overlapping producers and consumers. Competitors can be complementers under the right circumstances if you control the relationship. You're focusing on these core interactions, and you've got demand side economies of scale, fundamentally different. Note, by the way, not that these things don't matter. These will always matter. We'll always have supply side economies of scale. But you have to also manage these, the demand side economies of scale. If you don't, you'll be missing all these growth opportunities, innovation opportunities, and the design of network effects. You have to work on engagement, designing network effects. You want permissionless entry and opening around key control points. Not all the way open, you can't give it away, but you need permissionless, frictionless entry as opposed to barriers to entry in here. You need innovation by the firm and the ecosystem. That's when you get that high slope taken off. And again, our argument was everything we teach in business school takes on an external counterpart. R&D, operations, finance, human resources, strategy, ops, all of them. Value creating activities that used to be done exclusively inside the firm now have to be done also outside the firm, because you can't scale network effects inside the same way you scale them outside. This is going to change a lot of different industries. Automotive will be fundamentally changed. Car will become a platform. Blockchain, absolutely, finance will become a platform. City as a platform. Internet of Things as a platform. Energy and smart grids as a platform. Architecture, right? Business information modules as platforms. Education, we professors are also on the chopping block along with everybody else as you move to MOOCs and platforms. Healthcare, absolutely a platform. One question is going to be who's going to control that? Is that going to be insurance providers? Is it going to be the medical device manufacturers? There are some major battles that are going to take place on this front. Expect to see those in the next few years. So, the insights. Platforms beat products every time in the markets where they compete. You need to understand the dynamics of how these operate. They innovate faster, their value increases proportional to use, and they harness resources they don't own. The demand economies of scale are creating giant monopolies like those of the industrial era, but for the opposite reason. The business models differ because you invert the firm. You have to do value creating activities outside, not just inside. So all of the major functions of the firm take on new roles. You can predict these competitors by looking for overlapping users. So this is why so many companies get blindsided. A platform comes in from an adjacent market, and the technology looked nothing like what they were using. But they had overlapping users, and some third-party ecosystem partner comes in. Filofax predicting it's going to get wiped out by the phone? Garmin, right? HP calculators, but all of them were. And again, information and community are these critical resources. You need these communities to add margins and innovation and add stickiness to it. That's where you're creating your network effect. So those are the key ideas. Now, with that, I'm entirely happy to talk about any of those issues. I think it's time for a break, but we can go into definitions of network effects, how you modify your business architecture to take advantage of this. If you're interested in questions of making the transformation, if you're doing a product, how do you make those steps? What are the intellectual machinations are going to go do that? How do you manage openness? How do you monetize stuff that you're giving away? How do you measure it? Strategy, what changes there? We covered the majority of content that you would need there, but this is things that are there. For those that are interested, you've got copies of the books. This is where we prove this stuff for the academics. This is where we publish in Harvard Business Review to say, here's how you use it. So this has all the Greek. This has the basic insights in there. So very happy to field any of those that you'd like to talk about. So with that, let's take a break and we can come back and address any of the questions that you might have.
Stanley, are we over here?
Thank you.
Great.